Thank you for joining me for the 9th episode of the Doc Talk with Liz podcast. Guest starring today is Dr. Francisco Quintana. Dr. Quintana is a neurodegenerative disease researcher and professor at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, everybody. Today, our guest is Dr. Francisco Quintana. He is currently a multiple sclerosis researcher at Brigham and Women's Hospital and at Harvard Medical School, and we're very excited to have him on today. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Quintana.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course. So I'm very interested in your research because multiple sclerosis is something that interests me a lot. But before we kind of dive into that, I'm kind of curious to hear about how you got into science in the first place. Like, was this something you were always interested in, or did it kind of develop later in your life?
So I'm coming from a family of non-scientists at all. They're all lawyers at home. So, and at home, I mean, parents, grandparents. But as a child, as a kid, I always liked to play with kind of like engineering toys and stuff like that. And then when I was around 12, an aunt of mine started to give me as a present every month what would be the equivalent in Spanish of Scientific American.
Oh, okay.
And that was, I think that was the 80s. That was very exciting because it was all this excitement around genetic engineering and so on and so forth. So that really got me interested. And that really got me more and more into that. And then when the time came to choose a career, right? So for me, it was no doubt that that's what I wanted to do. And then since I'm coming from Argentina, right? So the question was where to do it. And at the time, the projects and the labs doing most of the research in molecular biology, genetic engineering were related with autoimmunity. Autoimmunity associated with a disease of South America, which is called Chagas disease, which is trypanosomiasis. It's an infection that causes, among other things, heart inflammation. So that literally took me from playing with Legos into doing science in molecular mechanisms.
Right. All right, definitely. So you currently research degeneration and multiple sclerosis. So what got you into multiple sclerosis specifically? I know that has a lot to do with autoimmunity. Was it kind of a natural transition to multiple sclerosis?
That was one part. And then another thing that was very important for me is my grandpa, the dad of my mom. So he was kind of like a big figure in my life. Like I think I spent many or most of my summers with him. They lived in the countryside. He was this huge person, right? Like physically big.
Yes.
But then he developed a neurologic disease, and then he went from that into a person that was bedridden and mentally impaired. So for me, that was very strong. I mean, how impactful it is, how a disease can really change what we are, right?
Right.
It's something I think a lot, right? And that's kind of like what motivates me in my work.
Yeah, I definitely get that because like I've said to you previously, my dad had multiple sclerosis, and that's what has motivated me to want to research it and, find better treatments and possibly a cure for it to be able to help people that are going through a situation that I've kind of been through before with taking care of my dad and that kind of thing. So it's definitely something that'll, push you forward every day, even when maybe experiments fail and that kind of thing. But, you always have that passion within you that kind of drives you forward. So I'm wondering, what exactly do you guys research with multiple sclerosis, or what kind of causes multiple sclerosis that, they call it autoimmune, but...
Well, basically, what behind what drives multiple sclerosis is, we have an immune system whose function is to fight off pathogens, right, and tumors and so on and so forth. For reasons that are not very clear, that immune system starts to attack the brain and the spinal cord.
Mm-hmm.
And that results basically in the death of neurons. And that, and as more and more neurons are lost, patients start to experience what is called neurological disability, right? They have problems in walking, in the vision, and so on and so forth. So that is actually sclerosis, multiple sclerosis in a phrase, right? It's an autoimmune disease. It's inflammation of the brain and the spinal cord.
Mm-hmm.
So what my lab is very interested in is in trying to understand how is that inflammation controlled and regulated, basically to identify new therapies by which we could manipulate it, stop it, and then provide new therapies for multiple sclerosis.
Right. So what have you guys found so far in regard to the roles of certain cells like astrocytes or microglia and their role in multiple sclerosis?
So, if we step back a little bit, if you were to ask anyone, what are the most abundant cells of the CNS, they will say neurons, right?
Right.
But they're wrong, as you know. Basically, the most abundant cell in the CNS is the astrocyte. And that's important because this is a cell type that for years was kind of neglected. It was thought to be a cell that was kind of a little bit of a bystander, providing kind of like the right conditions for neurons to thrive. That was kind of like the old view of the astrocyte. And now we know that these abundant cells are very important in terms of guiding, participating in the development of the brain and the spinal cord, participating in the function of the brain, spinal cord, how that is kind of irrigated by blood and so on, by CSF, which is some kind of fluid that bathes the CNS. But then what is even more important is that now we know that these cells, which remember is the most abundant cell of the CNS, is actually can be very pro-inflammatory, can actually kill neurons under certain conditions, and that these kind of pathogenic activities are deregulated, exacerbated in the context of MS and other neurodegenerative diseases. So what my lab is trying to do is trying to understand, one of our goals is to understand what are the mechanisms that control astrocytes? How is it that they do good and bad things? Actually, which are the astrocytes that do good and bad things? And then while doing so, then try to identify novel therapeutic targets. And our work has shown how, for example, pollutants can control the activity of astrocytes, how the gut flora and the food we eat can control the activity of astrocytes. So that's kind of in brief what we do related to those cells.
Okay, awesome. That's really interesting. So what model do you guys study this in?
So we work in multiple models. Basically, we work in zebrafish, we work in mice, and even within mice, multiple models of mice. And then we also work with human cells in culture or isolated from MS patients. So we go all the way from fish to humans.
Right. So why zebrafish? That kind of sounds a little bit strange, maybe. Is there a specific reason why you use zebrafish?
That's an excellent question, right? When we think about research, we know we are mammals, right? And we kind of think about mice relatively close to us, right? They are also mammals. They have an immune system and a central nervous system that is very similar to ours.
Yeah.
One problem with mice is that, they take space, right? Like it's very expensive to keep many of them. So if, for example, you want to test a collection of, let's say, 100 drugs, right? To see which one would affect inflammation in the brain, right? Which one would affect MS? To do it with 100 drugs is super expensive. And it takes, not only is expensive, it takes a lot of space, of time, of manpower. Zebrafish, they have, actually, we were among the first to describe that they have some features of the immune system that is similar to the immune system of mammals, including humans, right? For example, regulatory cells that are important. And the advantage is that they have also a CNS that are relatively similar to ours. And the advantage is that you can have, up to 5 embryos, right, which are fully developed in very limited space. So we can actually, in plates which are about this size, right, we can have up to 100 different groups of embryos, each group being treated with a different drug. So
Wow.
it offers us a unique opportunity to ask very specific questions, right? As always, you have to remember not every model is appropriate to answer every question,
Right.
but for some questions, such as, for example, for screening of genes or chemicals, they are unique. And for example, one thing we did recently was to use them to identify what we call environmental factors, pollutants, which could affect inflammation in the CNS. And indeed, we were able to identify, to perform like a screening in collaboration with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and literally identify specific herbicides, pesticides that are associated with the worsening of CNS inflammation.
Wow.
And we literally as we speak, we completed a similar study where we went after additional factors that control a different component of inflammation. In this case, environmental factors that control T cells, which are lymphocytes, also very important for autoimmunity and for CNS inflammation.
Wow. Okay, that is really interesting. Going off of the pollutants and that kind of thing, do you guys, and you said you do environmental factors as well. Do you guys do any research about vitamin D in multiple sclerosis or that role kind of with development of myelination?
We haven't actually. We do not work with vitamin D, but as you know, vitamin D is associated with sun exposure, right?
Right.
With sunlight. So what we have worked with is with melatonin, which is a hormone which is associated with daylight and nightlight. Basically, in the summer, those levels are decreased.
Yes.
And basically, we investigated how melatonin could affect and does affect mechanisms of inflammation relevant for multiple sclerosis. And we believe that might be important to explain why the frequency of attacks MS patients experience is different usually when you compare summer versus winter.
All right, awesome. So now I'm kind of going to ask you a question that you've posed to me in the past, which is why study like the specific environmental factors or specific treatments that you guys currently study, like why kind of looking at environmental factors instead of, I told you like the GRN gene and you're like, but why that gene out of the 29,000 other genes that also serve that kind of function? So why exactly these specific environmental factors over like other ones?
So that's an excellent question. And there are 2 points. First of all, we know that MS, like many other autoimmune diseases, right? It's a disease that has a genetic component, but also a very important, if not an even more important, environmental component. Meaning that, you have some genes that are going to predispose you or predispose someone to develop MS, right? But in addition to that, you need to be confronted or faced by specific environmental factors. And those could be pollutants, could be infections, so on and so forth, that will trigger in that specific genetic background the onset of MS. So that's why we believe that studying, we and it's kind of like the community believes that understanding the environmental factors that control the development of MS is important. And then you can take even the next approach to say, well, look, if a certain environmental factor is associated with the development of MS, it has to work via very specific, chemicals, so on and so forth. They work via very specific proteins and signaling pathways.
Right.
So if you identify a factor, then you can use it as a probe to identify new pathways that are involved in the control of inflammation. And once you identify the pathway, then you can start thinking, well, how can I modulate it as a way of treating inflammation? So that's kind of the reasoning. The other way or the other reason you can get to that is there might be some environmental observation and you want to understand what is the mechanism responsible. As I said, like, for example, there's this observation of different frequency of disease relapses between the summer and the winter. So another way to tackle that problem was for us to say, okay, what could be mediating that effect? What could be the mechanism responsible for it? And that's kind of what led us to melatonin and so on and so forth.
Wow, that's really cool. And then I'm also wondering, since you talked a little bit about the research that you guys do and some really interesting things that you guys study. So maybe there are other people that are really interested in multiple sclerosis, or I'm sure there are plenty of people interested in multiple sclerosis and other degenerative disorders. Do you have any tips or pieces of advice for people that want to go into STEM and study these kind of diseases?
So I think that there are many things that even through my kind of scientific life I've seen changing, right? And one of the things I see the most is how multidisciplinary our studies are becoming, right? And if you even look into our group, right, we've had from MDs to engineers, right, and bioinformaticians, and so on and so forth. So you can get to study those questions, right, from different through different paths, and that's kind of personal. It could be because you're interested in neurobiology, neurodevelopmental biology, because you're interested in inflammation, because you're interested in tool development, and that could be, like machines to bioinformatics. What I would say is first identify what's the approach that you like the most. And as exciting as science is, right, obviously you're confronted with lots of challenges, and if you're going to be doing something that's really cutting edge, you're going to fail a lot. So, but if you're really interested in what you're doing, you can deal better with failure. So what I would say is find the path that it's more relevant or closer to your heart. As I said, in general, this is coming, you can approach this type of problems from the point of view of basic biology or neurobiology, immunology, medicine, epidemiology, all of these, genomics, all of these fields, right, can be applied. And then what I would say is you need to my suggestion would be to get started into research. Because as we discussed, right, like it's very exciting to read about these problems, right? But you really get a different understanding of it the moment you start to, even, I wouldn't say at the very beginning you'll be designing your own experiment, right? But just participating in your own experiments, and then in experiments, and then you're confronted with the fact of like, wow, I have this great idea. What are the experiments I need to do in order to prove that hypothesis is right or not? And then when you go to do those experiments, you realize that you really, the tools to really address that question might not be there. So what are the tools you need to develop, or what is the question you can answer, right? And sometimes the answer, the solution to that complex problem is in between, right? So I think that I would say is important, because also that's important for you to decide what type of research you would like to do. And you could start by saying, what I thought I love to do immunology and inflammation, but now I realize I would love to get into neurobiology of oligodendrocytes, right? And myelin repair. And all of that is right. But my experience is that these are things you need to live through in order to really assess and understand and just experience, right? To see what you really like and should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. In the first part of this podcast episode, we learned that Dr. Quintana's journey started in Argentina. Although none of his family members were scientists, he always enjoyed playing with engineering toys as a kid. We also learned that Dr. Quintana first researched autoimmunity in Chagas disease before moving on to MS. Dr. Quintana was motivated to research degeneration because of his grandfather, who suffered from a neurodegenerative disease. MS occurs when the immune system begins to attack the CNS. This results in the death of neurons, which causes patients to experience disability. The most abundant cell in the CNS is the astrocyte. They can help protect the CNS, but can also be pro-inflammatory and cause damage. Lastly, there are many different environmental factors that can contribute to MS. Dr. Quintana studies the role of melatonin and summer versus winter in MS. Okay, so to kind of pick up from where we left off last time, you ended with giving us some tips for people that want to go into multiple sclerosis research. And now kind of to go back to what we talked about at the beginning, which were a lot about glial cells, astrocytes, kind of the pathogenicity of multiple sclerosis. I'm kind of curious as to what your favorite glial cell is and why.
So my favorite cell is the astrocyte because, as you know, is a star of the show, right? But honestly, the reason for that is because, even when they are the most abundant glial cell in the CNS, we still really know just a bit about the roles in disease in CNS physiology and pathology. So I think there's a lot to be learned, and I'm happy to be part of that process.
Awesome. And then do you have a favorite thing to study about multiple sclerosis? I'm guessing that it has something to do with astrocytes, but
well, I think cell-cell interactions, I think that's fascinating. And literally how cells from the CNS interact with other cells that are recruited from the periphery. I think there's so much to be done, and that's where our new method development is going.
Okay, very cool. And then going off of this with your research and everything that you do, I'm kind of curious as to what a kind of a day in your life looks like, and how you incorporate your hobbies and other interests outside of science into your life on top of all of
very good. So usually I wake up very early, super early actually, between 4:30 and 5.
Wow.
And then I do I do some reading, I do some writing until around 10 to 7. And then that's when I literally have like 20 minutes where I walk my son to the bus stop and wait for the bus with him. And it's kind of like a nice time to chat and see where we stand. Then I come back, wake up my daughter, and then we have breakfast with her, take her to school. Then I usually like to, especially now, I like to bike to the lab. So that's about 30 minutes. It's about 9 miles. So it's very nice because it's kind of nice. Then usually I would, then the lab day is kind of like, it goes between, writing whatever I have to write or read, right? Which is usually grants or papers, meeting with lab members, meeting now virtually with collaborators. And then usually around, I would say, between 6 and 7, depending on the day, I come back home. Then I would have some kind of exercise. Also, like I would exercise for about an hour, then we have dinner, and then usually we watch a movie with my wife. So that's kind of like how the day ends.
Awesome. That's really nice. Especially with like incorporating family time into that as well, which that's always a really nice thing to be able to.
And then usually just before going to sleep, I would try to read a chapter of something. I like to read about artists. Tend to be like, now I'm reading a book about artists, like short chapters about, I don't know, I like to hear what triggers their creativity, right? What moves them, what they try to achieve. I don't know, in general, I think there are lots of lessons for us as scientists to learn.
Oh, absolutely. That actually is another interesting thing that I've read about a little bit, is like art therapy or music therapy with multiple sclerosis, and those as therapeutic methods kind of for neuroplasticity and being able to restore some movement, or even just emotionally or physically or spiritually helping patients to and then on top of this, since you kind of walked us through like all of these different really interesting facts and you've given us tips, you've talked a little bit about what you do with your free time, and but also the trials that you can go through with science and the failures and successes and those different things. Would you have any words of encouragement to kind of close out on for encouraging other people that, want to go into science, but are maybe a little bit afraid of going into it, if you have words of encouragement for them?
I don't know if I have words of encouragement. I think that probably I went through the very same type of challenges and doubts myself. But I couldn't be happier with the fact that I eventually decided to follow science, right? And I think with all its challenges, I think it's a very rewarding profession, if you wish, right? I mean, it's nice to be challenged every single day with trying to address a question. I mean, and obviously it's tough not to answer the question, right? Or to fail while trying to do it. But I think it keeps you very stimulated, and there are few professions, I would say, or at least that I know of, where you can have that daily challenge that changes every day also, right? Because the problems and the questions we're trying to address today, hopefully, are going to be relevant in a couple of years. Right. So that's the only thing I could say, and that's it.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for coming on to talk about your experiences and just about multiple sclerosis in general. And go Astrocytes, I guess.
Very good. Have a great day.
Yes, you too. In the final part of this podcast episode, Dr. Quintana mentions that he has seen how interdisciplinary research has really become. He encourages people to find the specific path that is closest to their heart. It's important to live through science in order to assess what you want to do. Do research. Dr. Quintana's favorite glial cell is the astrocyte because it is the star of the show and has many important functions. Dr. Quintana's favorite thing to study about MS is cellular interactions. And Dr. Quintana starts his day very early with writing and taking his kids to school. He then bikes to and manages his lab. Once he gets home, he watches a movie with his wife and reads a book. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for future videos.